I was living and working in Hong Kong, and one day I found a lump on this side of my neck. And when I went to the doctor and they did a biopsy, they discovered that it was lymphoma, which is a form of lymphatic cancer. I was very, very shocked and surprised. So, over a period of 4 years, I developed so much fear of this cancer. And I was following everything. I was researching about it. And I lived my life. I started to live my life just trying to get rid of this cancer that was in my body. But I kept getting worse and weaker and weaker. And at that point, the doctors said that it's too late, even for anything. Your body is already too far gone. You're already dying. You only have about 3 months to live. I kept wishing that this was a bad dream. My body was not absorbing any nutrition. I weighed 85 pounds. I looked like a skeleton. My lungs were filled with fluid. The tumors now in my body were all over my lymphatic system. They were the size of golf balls. And by February the 1st, 2006, I went into a coma. The nurse gave me a big dose of morphine because I hadn't been able to sleep or anything for many days because of the fluid in my lungs. And I was in so much pain and so much discomfort. And then on February the 2nd, in the morning, I didn't wake up. So it was at that point that the doctors told my family that these were my final hours and that my organs were now shutting down and I was going through the dying process. But what everybody around me didn't know was that I had left my body and I felt amazing. I could see and feel and hear everything that was happening all around me, but I felt light and free, and all the pain was gone and all the fear was gone. Something that I call unconditional love, I'd never felt anything like that in my physical life before. And I was aware of my body lying there in that hospital bed, but my body looked so small and helpless and lifeless compared to how I was feeling now. And I wanted my family to know that I'm fine. In fact, I'm better than fine. I feel fantastic. But there was no way for me to communicate with them. I was able to see and hear everything the doctors were doing, like they were taking fluid out of my lungs. And it was very different from having physical eyes. It was more like I had 360-degree peripheral vision. I could be aware of things that were happening behind, on the sides, above, below, everywhere, and beyond the walls. I was seeing and hearing conversations take place beyond the hospital room. And my husband was talking to the doctor outside, about 40 feet away, outside the room that I was in, and I was able to see and hear everything. I could even see and be aware that my brother, who was living in a different country, he was living in India at the time, I was able to see that he was rushing to get on a plane to come and reach me because he wanted to get to me before I died. I remember even feeling, gosh, I better not die until he gets here.
Like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I knew science is the pathway to truth. And as much as I wanted to believe a lot of what I'd heard in my Methodist church growing up about an afterlife, about God, power of prayer, my work in science, and especially as I pursued a career in neurosurgery, left me wondering how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. So I taught for about 15 years at Harvard Medical School. That was all setting the stage for my near-death experience. So it's important to point out we never, ever understood why this happened. When I first got to the emergency room, the doctors were very alarmed because of how quickly I'd gone downhill. Over 3.5 hours, I was deep in coma, grand mal seizures, and they found out the next day from microbiology that it was gram-negative bacterial meningitis caused by E. coli. And then, of course, they put me on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics on a ventilator, and I went through that week not really showing any signs of improvement. So by the end of the week, the doctors held a family meeting on day 7 of coma. It was a Sunday morning, when they said it was, I was gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2% chance. But unfortunately, they thought if I was in that 2% survivor category, that would never translate into any meaningful recovery. So that's why they suggested stopping the antibiotics and just letting nature take its course. Let the infection run, let me go. So way too deep in coma to have had any experience, especially when you realize that the CT and MRI show extensive damage. And yet the exact opposite is what I experienced. So how that journey unfolded was, beginning in that earthworm eye view, I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light. Initially, that portal led up into what I call the Gateway Valley. It was far more real than this world. It makes this world look like a dream. That's one thing that people have trouble understanding, because they think this is hardcore reality. Well, that world is far more real than this one. It was so refreshing and reassuring, I cannot put it into words. And it was soon after that that I had this sensation of a soft summer breeze blowing through that was like my first awareness of the divine presence of that infinitely loving force that so many other near-death experiences from all continents, all cultures, all belief systems, all millennia in the last 5,000 years have talked about this same kind of realm. And that's where our religions come from and all that.
To me, it felt very, very real. In fact, it felt more real than this physical reality. It was as if my awareness was expanding more and more, like going through different levels, because after a while, I started to leave this physical level. And when we leave our physical body, we leave behind everything that's associated with our body, our biology, our voice, our race, our religion. All of that gets left behind. And what crosses over is just pure essence, pure spirit, or pure love. We can call it whatever we want. And so I started to encounter the essence or the spirit of other people who were familiar to me, like my dad, who had died 10 years ago. I felt his presence around me. And even though he wasn't in his physical body, I recognized him immediately. It was literally like his energy and my energy just merged. And I was like, oh, Dad, it's you. I just knew. And we're not even talking to each other. We don't need to explain who we are. We know what each other is feeling right away without words. My dad and I, when I was growing up, we had a very turbulent relationship because I rebelled against my culture. I come from a culture where women are considered second-class citizens. And so my dad and I clashed a lot, and I even ran away from an arranged marriage. So when he passed away, I had always thought that I had let him down, that I had disappointed him as a daughter. But now here he was on the other side with me, and all I felt from him was pure, unconditional love. And I felt he understood why I was the way I was. So it was just the most incredible feeling. I then felt that I was surrounded by other beings, and I didn't recognize them all from this life, but I did feel that I was just unconditionally loved by them and that they were there to protect me and help me. And I started to understand that I've always been protected, but not just me, we all are, but we don't realize it. We don't know this.
I was surprised by the incredible power of love that I felt by thousands of beings around me going off into the mist with their heads down, murmuring, many praying. I remember the angelic choirs above that were fueling all this beautiful dancing and merriment served as yet another portal to higher and higher levels, all the way out to what I call the core. Infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with unconditional love of that divine source. And I would cycle through those levels. I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, but I could navigate back up by remembering the sounds. The music provided portals to traverse those realms. And I'd been told every time I entered the Corps, you are not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things.
And then a lot happened on that side, but I reached a point where I felt that I had a choice as to whether to come back into my body or to stay on the other side. No part of me wanted to come back because my body was sick and dying. I was suffering here. My family was suffering, taking care of me. But it was like I entered this state of clarity where I then understood why I had been sick. I understood how it was that so many of the thoughts and the decisions and the choices I had made in my life had led me to that point where I was lying there on that hospital bed. And I realized that I had lived this life of fear instead of a life of passion and joy and love. I had never allowed my soul, my spirit, to express itself and be all that it had come here to be, and that I was more powerful than I had ever known or believed. So in this state of clarity, I received the message that now that you know the truth of who you really are, go back. If you choose to go back into your body will heal. And it was at this point that I felt my dad was telling me, you need to go back. It's not your time yet. And so it was at that point that I made the choice to come back. I started to understand that I had a bigger purpose to fulfill, something much bigger. And I didn't know what it was. I had no idea what it was. But it was like I had the understanding that all I have to do is be myself and live my life fearlessly, and my purpose would unfold before me. And it was at that point that I started to come out of the coma. My family and everybody around me were really shocked, but they were so happy that my eyes were opening up. It was like I had one foot on each side. I kept saying to them, Dad is here. Dad's telling me that it's not my time. I'm going to be fine. And I was just saying this over and over, and they were wondering what's going on. The doctor basically told my family, don't raise your hopes because she's still critical. Sometimes it happens. And then the doctor said, these are the drugs just messing with her mind. She's hallucinating. But then I said to the doctor, aren't you the doctor that took the fluid out of my lungs at about 4 a.m. this morning? And that's when he said, but you were in a coma. You couldn't know that. So he got really shocked and started to wonder what's going on. I said to my husband, isn't he the doctor that said, I'm not even going to make it through the night? And my husband said, you couldn't possibly have heard that. He said that to me outside of the room, down the hallway near the nurses' station. And then what started to happen is over the next few days, the tumors just continued to shrink and the doctors just could not understand it. I had to start getting a little bit stronger and start getting out of bed. And within 3.5 weeks, they could find no trace of the cancer anymore. And within 5 weeks, they let me go home to live my life cancer-free. And that was 14.5 years ago.
And then I came back to this world. But when I did, when I woke up in that ICU bed on day 7 of coma, all I knew was where I had been. My brain was so wrecked, and I still had no memories of my life before. So when I was first coming out of coma and they first extubated me, I was still not even recognizing loved ones at the bedside, although that recognition in my language came back very rapidly, literally over hours. Memories were even more complete than they had been before coma. That was something that was a real shock. Everything turned around tremendously. I mean, inexplicably. And that's one of the points that's made in that case report about my medical records, is how this is not just like, oh, well, we see this, 1% of the time, or we just don't see it.
So the medical people's opinions was very, very mixed. One thing that they all agreed on is that I am lucky to be alive. They all agreed that I should have died. Another one of my doctors says that all the things that I experienced, what I say happened on the other side, seeing my dad and everything, he says that was my brain hallucinating. And he says that was the drugs messing with my mind. But that's the other part that the doctors and the medical people could not explain, is how was I able to see my brother? How did I know he was on a plane flying to see me? And how did I hear the doctors? But my doctor who was treating me actually said that you're not the first person to tell me such a story. And he said he has heard other patients who have experienced crossing over on the other side. And what happened, though, is that I was interviewed once by a local newspaper. And then the newspaper journalist said to me, "Would your doctor be willing to verify everything that happened?" And I said, yes, he completely believed me. But when the newspaper interviewed him, he didn't say everything the way he said it to me. And he was too embarrassed to speak it publicly. And many years later is when another doctor said to me that, yeah, if we say these things publicly, we can be ridiculed and we can even lose our license.
True open-minded skepticism is absolutely important ingredient in this quest. I will say I was my own worst skeptic. I'd spent 54 years of my life honing a very conventional scientific worldview. But essentially, my coma journey to a neurosurgeon interested in explaining consciousness had a tremendous number of lessons to help me understand that much of what we thought was completely wrong. And what I've found is in the 11 years since, I've worked with many scientists around the world who are interested in consciousness. All of the tremendous evidence that is available to all of us who study things like the afterlife, parapsychology, the reality of things like telepathy, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences. All these phenomena of consciousness, bringing science and spirituality together and explaining consciousness in a much more satisfactory fashion than the very bleak and paltry fiction of materialist explanation. So obviously, you have to study these phenomena directly.
My name is Dean Radin. I'm the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. If you don't know what ions is, then you should not be watching this movie because it's too late, basically. The Institute of Noetic Sciences is an institute devoted to studying the nature of consciousness. It's part of a spectrum of experiences. So some of them are psychic, some are mystical, some are déjà vus, clairvoyance, precognition, the whole range of experiences that are actually very common in terms not of belief, but of what people actually experience. These kinds of things happen. The next question is, well, why don't we find departments of psychic research in every university? The answer is that in the modern world, we follow a certain set of assumptions about the way that reality is. And so a philosopher would call it materialism. And it's the idea that everything that we know, including the mind, is made up out of matter and energy. From that perspective, the idea that aspects of your mind or awareness can transcend space and time, because that's the strangeness of mystical and psychic experience, these things are considered impossible. It's not possible to have parts of your awareness extending away from your brain. So because the prevailing idea is that it's impossible, the only way of understanding the experiences is that they're either made up, or they're coincidence, or some other mundane explanation.
One of the problems with materialist science is they keep looking in the material world to try and prove things. So if you're looking at the physical brain and you're saying, well, we assume that this thing creates consciousness, and then you see all these things you can measure, like on a functional MRI or on magnetoencephalography or a spectral electroencephalogram or whatever your mode of examining the brain, if you're sitting there thinking whatever we see is going to explain it all, you're obviously misled. Sorry, it's not there.
I think it's important to be clear that the brain and the mind, or the brain and internal experience, are clearly correlated with each other. So there's a relationship between brain activity and our internal experience. But that relationship actually doesn't say very much about what is the causal direction. The usual presumption is that the brain processing is the causal reason why we have consciousness. But that's an inference that would be very difficult to justify, because it could just as well be in the other direction. And in fact, this is what gives rise to ideas that it's not that the brain is generating consciousness, but rather the brain is receiving consciousness or as a filter of consciousness, which is somehow out there. This is the difference between looking at a radio and listening to it playing music and opening up the radio expecting to find little tiny people with instruments in it. Well, that's not what happens. You open the radio and you see something which ultimately is receiving information that's coming from somewhere else.
From the time I was a child, I was intrigued by the physical world and by what is the mind. So I went on and got my PhD in neuroscience and then began doing research in rehabilitation neuroscience. So things like working with children with cerebral palsy, people with stroke, people with Parkinson's disease, and trying to find new therapies to help them move better, to make their brains function better again. So I enjoy that, but I should say that at a certain point in my career, I had an experience in meditation at a meditation retreat that shifted my whole understanding of awareness. I was a bit in a quandary because I had a sense that there was more to consciousness than I had originally thought. And everybody on this world would say the brain is very important in our embodied consciousness. We all know that. But at the same time, when you look at other research, for example, on near-death experiences, you find out somebody has had cardiac arrest, their brain has completely stopped, and yet these people nevertheless retain their consciousness, and they do something even more than that. They actually see now everything around them from a perspective outside of their body. The point is that if there is no brain activity in the entire cortex, there couldn't even be a hallucination. And that's what the materialist neuroscientists have to deal with. And of course, one of the things they'll say is, well, maybe the experience happened when there was still a little bit of brain activity and they just thought it was happening in the middle of the coma. But in fact, you can prove by what they were seeing that they were definitely in the middle of a deep, deep coma with no brain activity, watching things happening then. And they are seeing non-local events that would be impossible even to see with the normal brain.
You've been studying the wrong thing. The brain doesn't produce consciousness, but is simply that a transceiver or a filter. A filter is a beautiful word for it, and that's not a new theory. That actually came more than 100 years ago from the likes of William James, who was a renowned Harvard psychologist. F.C.S. Schiller was another proponent of filter theory, as was Aldous Huxley, who wrote Doors of Perception. He came to realize that consciousness was far more profound than just something produced by a brain locally.
So right now, the brain filters everything out but the five senses, and therefore I see you and the things around me as almost like a measly trickle, someone said, of what is actually available for me to see. And the idea that William James brought forth was that when you have a mystical experience or a near-death experience, what happens is those filters in the brain are actually partially removed. But in normal waking physical consciousness, those filters are there for a good reason, to help us function in this physical world.
Yeah, clearly what we perceive with our ordinary senses in the everyday world is not the world. It's a cartoon of the world. We're picking up portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is very thin. It goes from DC, or 0 hertz, up to basically infinity. We're picking up a thin slice. This is true for every one of our senses. So we're picking up little tiny pieces of an energetic world out there, and from that constructing the world that we see. So our sense of what is out there, our common sense view, is a construction. We know that. That's easy to demonstrate. Then, of course, it begs the question, well, what is the real world? What is it really like? There it gets much more difficult to talk about. One would think, perhaps, that under certain degrees of meditative experience, under transformative experiences that could be spontaneous, what is often reported is typically by mystics, that they now experience the world the way it actually is.
One thing that happens with many people who have a near-death experience is that when they come back, they now have psychic abilities that they don't even necessarily want. And sometimes these psychic abilities frighten them.
What we study are experiences, ultimately. People have strange experiences. So they would include things like precognitive dreams and presentiments of things about to unfold, telepathic experiences, mind-matter interaction effects, those kinds of things. The challenge from a scientific perspective is how do you then take those experiences bring it into the laboratory so you can study it under controlled conditions where you can tell the difference between a coincidence and a real effect. So for precognition, many different types of experiments all suggest that we do have the capacity to know what's about to unfold, even under conditions where we can't infer it. We also have many experiments showing that through clairvoyance, that we can perceive, not always visually, but we can perceive something that is happening at a distance. So that means that both through space and through time, we somehow can do that. We have the perception ability to do that. Another whole class of studies is the nature of whether consciousness survives bodily death. So is consciousness part of the body or not? It clearly interacts in some way, but maybe it doesn't need the body. So these are survival-based studies where we look at things like mediumship and near-death experiences and those kinds of phenomena, some of which can be brought into the laboratory, and we can verify whether or not, for example, a medium who claims to be talking to a dead person and getting information from that dead person, is the information correct under conditions where they can't fake it or they can't get the information in other ways. And there too, we can verify that that actually does happen sometimes. We're maybe capable of much more than we currently think. From a scientific perspective, these things shouldn't happen, but they do happen. So clearly we've missed something important. So I want to find out what it is. What does it mean?
I'm Rupert Sheldrake. I'm a biologist. I did research at Cambridge on the development of plants. I taught at Cambridge. I was a fellow of Clare College. I studied philosophy at Harvard. I did history and philosophy of science there. The reason I did that was because when I was a student in Cambridge, I felt that biology had become very limited by this mechanistic theory of life, treating animals and plants as machines and treating people as machines. And I wanted to see if it's possible to have a philosophy of science, a way of doing science that was more broad and more inclusive. Since then, I've been doing research in morphic resonance, memory in nature, and on unexplained abilities of animals and people. There's a lot of evidence for these phenomena. I mean, from years of research by psychic researchers and parapsychologists. But from the materialist point of view, all my mental activity is in my head. So if I think about you and you're 100 kilometers away and I want to telephone you, and you start thinking about me, and when I ring you, you say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you," a very common kind of telepathy. Almost everyone has experienced this, and I've shown by means of controlled, randomized experiments that this is not just chance coincidence. But from a materialist point of view, that's impossible. My thoughts cannot possibly influence you 100 kilometers away. A phenomenon like telepathy is impossible. Therefore, all the evidence for it, the fact that most people say they've experienced it, it just proves these are stupid people who've not been educated enough. And if there's evidence for it from scientific experiments, like my experiments, or those of Dean Radin or many other scientists, then those experiments must be flawed. There must be some error in the experiments. This debate has been going, it's not really a debate, because it's a denial campaign has been going on for decades, and enormously influences the educational systems. Most people are interested in these phenomena because they actually happen and they influence their lives. But then when they see a culture of denial in the scientific world, what this does is makes people feel that science is dogmatic, narrow, and limited, and they're right.
It's really unfortunate the way science is practiced today. It's kind of like an old boys club where about the only way to get things done is to do experiments that prove the accepted hypotheses about the universe. And yet when you hit all these jagged edges that say the model is wrong, what our current community tries to have us do is, well, no, stick to the plan. But if you sooner or later get to a point, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out in his book about scientific revolutions back in the mid-20th century, where you have a breaking point, where there's so much evidence that breaks the rules of the reigning paradigm that you have to basically throw the paradigm out.
So at this time, there are approximately 10 different meta-analyses of classes of experiments looking at various kinds of psychic phenomena, published in mainstream journals. So why does it remain controversial? They will say that the reason why these studies look like they're significant is because of questionable research practices, the dreaded QRPs. So the QRPs include things like selective reporting. So that you're only publishing the positive results and you're not publishing the negative results, which would create